If you were alive on the night of November 9th, 1989, you might well remember watching television and rejoicing at the thrilling scene of the Berlin Wall coming down. I'll never forget that. On both sides of the wall, the streets were filled with ecstatic people shouting and cheering, laughing and dancing, running through unguarded checkpoints, taking chisels and hammers to sections of the wall, pinching themselves just to make sure they weren't dreaming. Indeed, in that moment of unity, it felt like a dream come true. A dream come true. Some 2,500 years earlier, the Jewish people also rejoiced at their dream come true. You see, for 70 years, they had been living in a foreign land, living in exile in that faraway country of Babylon, oppressed as slaves, ridiculed for their customs and religious practices, trying in vain to make the best of their lives in the worst of circumstances. And then, suddenly, the powers that be told them, you are free to go, free to return home, free to go back and rebuild your lives. Indeed, it was a dream come true. And they rejoiced and they praised God and they marveled at the wonder of the miraculous reversal of their lot in life as they made their way home. The first 3 verses of the psalm that we just read together are an expression of their marvel at how God had reversed their fortunes, changed their circumstances for the better. But their shouts of joy did not last very long. You see, once they got back home, things weren't nearly as good as they had imagined them to be. Not even close. Their beloved city of Jerusalem lay in ruins, walls, temple, homes, economy. During their 70-year absence, little had been done to maintain or sustain the city or countryside. Outside the city, the vineyards and farmlands had been left largely untended and were not producing. The people who had not been carried off into exile in 70 years beforehand had stayed there, they had practically given up on life. A paralysis born of despair and fear had become their daily norm. So indeed, things back home weren't at all as the returning exiles imagined they would be. And so we have the second half of this psalm, which is a fervent prayer to God to restore them, to change their circumstances for the better. As they look through the ruins and through their tear-filled eyes, they long to once more let loose with those shouts of joy and proclaim that all is well. And so do we, don't we? But it's hard to rejoice when we look around at the world and we see that all is not well. Indeed, amidst mass shootings and climate change and violence and racism and threats of war, the shouts of joy do not come easily. Nevertheless, Psalm 126 is a call to live joyfully in the present right now. The Lord has done great things for us, the psalmist says, and that remains true regardless of how dark the present day seems. In other words, the psalmist affirms that the distress of the present does not change what God has done in the past, and the distress in the present does not alter God's promise for the future. For whenever the oppressed have been set free, whether in 6th century BC Babylon or 20th century Berlin, the hand of God has been at work. Whenever the oppressed will be set free, now and in the future, the hand of God will be at work, and that is enough reason to rejoice. Living joyfully in the present, even as you view life through tear-filled eyes, that's what this psalm is about. And it offers some hints about how we might live joyfully in the present, even on days today and in times like these. First, you marvel at the ways God has made God's presence known in the past. You marvel. With awe and thanksgiving, you remember and you name and you recount and you celebrate the great things God has done. That's what it means to marvel. Let me spell that out again. To marvel means to remember and name and recount and celebrate with a spirit of awe and thanksgiving God's life-restoring activities in this world. And that's the very first thing the psalmist does. And that's what we're invited to do, to marvel. Now, to marvel is a spiritual practice that helps you name the presence of God in all of life's circumstances. A spiritual practice is something that you do on a regular basis to connect you to the God of life, even when you don't feel like doing it, especially when you don't feel like doing it. Kind of like the kid who practices her musical instrument when she'd rather be outside. Kind of like some of us get out of bed to exercise when we'd rather go back to sleep. Spiritual practice is a discipline. And in times when you have trouble seeing the hand of God at work in the present, in times when you find it becoming all too easy to imagine that God has abandoned us, that God will never again work wonders in our midst and in our world, that the age of miracles is over. These are the times when we must, as people of faith, with great intention, rely on a well-developed practice of marveling at the things God has done, marveling to sustain us and perhaps even help us draw out of the pit of despair. That's what marveling can do. Now, there are many, many ways to engage in the spiritual practice of marveling at what God has done. You can recite the Psalms that recount the mighty acts of God throughout history. You can sing hymns of praise. You can read the book of Acts. You can keep a gratitude journal. You can take prayer walks in nature. You can regularly surround yourself with people of faith who inspire you. You can celebrate milestones like the psalmist did when in naming that time of great joy when God freed those exiled slaves. When you think of what God has done in the past, it helps you marvel. A milestone happened at the recent General Assembly of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ when we marveled at how a half a century ago God brought together black disciples churches and mission agencies and white disciples churches and mission agencies and formed us into one body that we named the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. The celebration of that 50-year anniversary was a glorious reminder of the ways that God has guided and sustained and will continue to do the same as we as a church are challenged to confront the sin of racism that is breaking our nation apart. So first, to experience joy in the present is to marvel at what God has done in the past. And as the psalmist says in verse 3, yes, the Lord has done great things for us, and we are overjoyed. Not we were overjoyed, not we will be overjoyed, but we are overjoyed right now. But marveling at what happened in the past is not the whole story. behind what it means to experience joy in the present. It's part of it, but not the whole thing. You see, and this is the second point, joy in the presence comes from trusting that God is not done in this world. Trusting that God has not written us off. Trusting that God always has and always will seek to restore and bring wholeness to all of creation. Unless we can fully trust that God is always and will always be in the restoration business, simply reveling about the good old days will produce an unhealthy nostalgia, and we'll get stuck in the past, and we'll become cynical about the present, and we'll be totally unable to imagine, much less live into, the hopeful future that God has in store for us. The psalmist trusts fully that God is all about doing the work of restoration, doing what it takes to change the present circumstances for the better. And so we see this bold prayer, "Restore us, Lord," the psalmist says. I love the chutzpah behind this prayer. The psalmist doesn't say, "Oh, help us through this troubled time." The psalmist doesn't say, "Why me, God?" The psalmist doesn't simply say, "I wait patiently." The psalmist says, "Restore us, Lord, now." The psalmist, who is so overjoyed by what God has done in the past, and so certain about who God is and about what God does and God will do, the psalmist is able to boldly say to God, "You restored us before, and now restore us again." "Restore us, Lord," is a prayer that trusts God to change circumstances for the better. Now, the psalmist acknowledges that the change can be sudden and can feel miraculous, like the way a dry desert blooms overnight after a sudden downpour of rain fills the riverbeds and spills over and blesses the land with water and new life, and everything is suddenly green and growing. That's the kind of restoration we all want, that sudden kind. And those of you who have experienced the miracle of a sudden reversal for the better, I want you to tell your stories, because they'll encourage us, and because truth be told, even though not many of us experience the intense joy of a sudden restoration, secretly we all want God to snap those divine fingers and just like that restore us and this world back to wholeness. But more often than that, more often than not, that's not how God restores, is it? More often than not, God's restorative work is gradual, with bumps along the way. And the psalmist knows this. And that's why in those first lines of verses 5 and 6, we are given another image of restoration, the image of planting while you cry. This is not an image that evokes a lot of joy immediately, does it? Planting is hard work with no immediate gratification and no guarantee of good result. And crying is an expression of grief and anger and discouragement and loss. But planting is also an act of hope. To plant means that you have faith in the future. And tears point to the raw truth that life in this moment is not what it should be. And so to cry is to express sorrow over the reality of a broken world. So planting with tears is an act of faith that says we can hope even while we're crying. Planting with tears is an act of faith that acknowledges pain and grief and anger, but does not succumb to its spiral that leads to despair. Planting while crying is an act of faith that leverages our tears and channels them into streams of a hope that nourish and fertilize and contribute to God's restorative work in this world. So, like the psalmist, we plant in hope, even when through tear-filled eyes we can barely see the soil that is waiting to be tilled. But the soil is there. So, in faith, plant we will. Plant we will. Like the Apostle Paul did when, through his own suffering and tears, planted the truth of Christ's love for all and joyfully trusted that one day the harvest will come. Let us plant with tears. Like Rosa Parks did when, in tears of anger and frustration, she planted herself on the seat of a bus, refused to give it up, and joyfully trusted that one day a harvest of new laws will help bring equal opportunity to all God's people, regardless of the color of their skin. Let us plant with tears, dear friends. Like Saint Mother Teresa did when, with tears of empathy, she planted herself on the streets of Calcutta, joyfully trusting that one day a harvest of compassion will restore hope among the poor and hungry of her city. Let us plant with tears, dear friends, like some of you plant yourself here every single Sunday in spite of your tears of suffering and pain, so you can welcome guests when they come, so you can lift up and bring joy to this space. Plant with tears like some of you do when you plant yourselves in the court of law and through your tears advocate for children who have no voice but yours. Plant your tears like some of you do with when you plant yourself at the Shalom Center or the New Hope Family Shelter, and through tears listen to someone's story. Like some of you do when you mentor families who are struggling just to keep their heads up and a roof over their home. Let us plant with tears. Another sort of tears flowed Monday morning on the little cul-de-sac that I have called home for 25 years, and these were tears of fear and confusion. Two neighbors. One lived on one side of us, the other on the other side of our house, found in their driveways Ziploc plastic bags containing nice little Tootsie Rolls for the kids and a KKK flyer that calls upon citizens of Bloomington to keep neighborhoods safe for white people. Both of these families identify as other than white. And so you can imagine their confusion and their concern for their own children. And because our street is small and pretty tight-knit, Bruce and I too have been upset about this latest attempt to spread hatred and fear and division. So, taking the lead from the psalmist, we are praying, "Restore us, Lord." And then, with tears of solidarity for our neighbors, we'll plant in our yard a sign that makes it absolutely clear that hatred is not welcome in our yards and in our town, and that the safety and the lives of their beautiful black and brown and tan-skinned children that run through our yard, their safety and lives matter to us and matter to God. And we'll plant our feet in the voting booth and exercise our right to vote next election. I hope you all do too. And we'll plant our postage stamps on letters that we send to our lawmakers that encourage them to address the complex issues that are breaking us, our nation, apart. And we'll plant our money in those places that are addressing the sin of racism in ways that reflects God's restorative power and presence in this world and love for all people. And we'll invite you all to do the same. Disciples, friends, followers of Jesus, let us all plant with tears of love that unite us as one, tears of determination that strengthen God's call for justice, tears of purpose that fertilize the cause of peace, tears of compassion that will not stop flowing until all God's children know the bounty of God's love, and yes, tears of hope that trust fully in a God who is, no doubt about it, in the restoration business. Tears of joy that anticipate God's great harvest of healing and love. That's what we can do. And as we plant with our tears, and as we marvel over the great things that the Lord has done and is doing and will do for us and with us and through us, let us, even on this day, echo the faithful voice of the psalmist who proclaims, "We are overjoyed, for God is good." Amen.